Thanks for joining us on this NAB Express webcast brought to you by Broadcast Beat. My name is Chris Chinnock. I'm the Executive Director of the 8K Association, and we've got some really good panelists with us today. We're going to talk today about 8K content creation, mastering, and production. A second webinar that we're going to do a little bit later will cover more of the distribution aspects of 8K, getting that content to the home. But today we want to focus on the front end part of this. So I want to start with a few slides just to give a little quick introduction to the 8K Association and what we're trying to do. Right, so the goals of the organization. First and foremost, we want to talk about 8K to both professionals and consumers, and really talk about the benefits and advantages of capturing an 8K and delivering 8K content, which we will talk more about with our experts today. And that includes both education and promotion of products and services. We want to secure native 8K content for our members so they can experiment with that and use it to, again, help educate and promote. And we believe that OTT is probably going to be the right initial platform for getting 8K services to consumers. So we want to do all we can to encourage the development of that part of the ecosystem. And we want to generally facilitate communication within the whole 8K ecosystem, because this is not just about cameras, it's not just about TVs. You need an entire ecosystem for this to work. So we need to take an ecosystem approach to developing this. And one of the features that we are also developing is a certification program. So this will be initially for TVs, and we may add some additional products at a later date. So we formed the organization at CES in 2019. We held our first seminar, a full-day seminar at NAB, which actually was physically held in 2019. By IFA timeframe, we had developed a detailed specification for the 8K TVs. And by the end of last year, we developed a test specification. So now TVs can go to market that pass this certification, and they'll be able to display this logo on the packages at retail. And if you look carefully, I think you will start to see this logo starting to show up already, or if not, very soon. So we're now up to 24 members, which I think is pretty good considering our start just over a year ago. As you can see, we've got a lot of TV brands and a lot of panel makers. But we're also starting to fill out this ecosystem with more folks in that supply chain, that ecosystem. Streaming service providers, technology and equipment providers, chipset providers, and content creators, including Imax, who is on the call today. An action plan for this year, we have a marketing work group that's going to focus on promoting the 8K Association and the certified logo. We'll be working on more demos and media briefings. In the technology work group, we have our first specification for TVs, and now we're going through the revisions to that specification. How can we make that spec better? How can we raise the bar a little bit more so we have a higher performance level for our 8K TVs? And the whole point of this specification and the certification process is to give a level of confidence to consumers that when they see the logo, they're getting a quality 8K TV product. So that's the goal. And then the certification work group, which is kind of a companion to the specification, we validate that the TVs meet the specification, and we'll also be looking at doing a market audit process this year to ensure compliance and work with third-party labs if they want to be able to do testing as well. And the content and delivery work group, we're now working on a project which is basically to first secure content for our members, but also to document the workflows, the 8K workflows that are out there in the wild today and being actually implemented. And well, this is actually a topic we want to talk more about in our call today. So that is the main stuff I wanted to cover in this outline here. We have a website that you can go to now. This is more professional focused, but we're going to have a consumer-facing one coming soon. And that's my contact information. And now let's introduce our panelists. So Dan Duran, Michael Ciani, we've got Eric Messerschmidt, and Bruce Marco from Imax. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. So Bruce, why don't you kick it off first, since you're in the top position here on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, hi, I'm Bruce Marco, and I'm in charge of post-production at Imax. It covers a lot of things that we do at Imax. It also includes covering our production elements with our camera department and the different types of things, kind of from A to Z, in terms of things that we're either doing ourselves or working with studios on, in terms of programs on how to optimize movies for IMAX theaters. And I'm also heavily involved in our IMAX Enhanced program, which is our new home format that we have. It's actually not a format. I take that back. It's a home version of movies featuring an enhanced sound and picture using our IMAX DMR technology. So I kind of oversee a lot of those different initiatives as well as our entire post-production operation.
Michael, you want to go next?
Thanks for having me, Chris. My name is Michael Cioni, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Innovation at the SaaS company Frame.io. My job is usually focused on looking around the corner. So I'm always trying to anticipate and predict where the next trends are going to be and work in spaces in which those trends are going to emerge, how to help them emerge for mainly creative use. My specialty is in trying to decipher the technology in creative languages and kind of homogenize them together, because I strongly believe that the future of the media and entertainment industry is going to require more people to be equal parts technically savvy and creatively minded, which I call being technative, so that people understand that the separation between technology and creativity is not something that we can really rely on if we want to be proficient and efficient in the future.
And Eric.
Hi, sure. My name is Eric Messerschmidt. I'm a cinematographer, director of photography. I just recently completed both seasons of Netflix's Mindhunter, and currently in post-production on HBO Max's Raised by Wolves from producer-director Ridley Scott, and Mank, the feature film Mank, directed by David Fincher. I'm also a bit of a technologist, and I love participating in the conversation from standpoint of high resolution capture like 8K, 6K, color workflow, anything pertaining to my end of the stream.
Hey, I'm Dan Duran from Red Digital Cinema. I'm Red's post-imaging technology specialist, so I do a lot of Red's workflows and integration and helping support high-end productions, all the way to a lot of the software vendors out there. And yeah, I've been at Red for 13 years, so I've gone through the 4K workflow with the Red 1, all the way up to our current 8K workflow with our Monstros and Helium cameras.
Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen. You are the experts here, so I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and let's get your opinions. So the first thing I'd like to ask is perhaps the most obvious question is, and let's separate this into capturing versus mastering and production. So why capture in 8K?
There's two reasons, I think, main reasons. But one is that I think currently you from a consumer standpoint, you have really far more larger and larger high quality TVs being introduced into the home and purchased into the home. The screen sizes keep getting bigger, high dynamic range. 4K is really pretty much the standard of what people are buying today. So that the home experience is becoming way more immersive and much higher quality than it ever used to be. And of course, now we have 8K sets coming into the market as well. So I think that as people have much higher quality display devices in the home and much larger display devices in the home, besides it becoming a more immersive experience, it's also way more revealing in terms of issues or compromises in the quality of the images that are being broadcast or streamed. So I think that that's where you would think that both filmmakers and content creators want to have consumers having the best quality image in the home for these higher quality display devices like we've never had before. And I think that if you don't adopt 8K capture and workflows in post-production and just higher quality capture and post-production technology, you really are starting to kind of risk that quality issue in the home environment as time goes on. So I think that's really, and I think consumers are demanding more of that from their home entertainment as well. And, from a theatrical standpoint, of course, as well, while most theatrical is now 4K projection technology, it's still having higher quality image capture and post-production. Actually still, because of oversampling, you actually still have a better image on screens. And that's something at IMAX that we've worked with all the time, because our screens are 50% larger on average than typical cinema screens. So we see the differences in resolution capture and post-production quality and finishing on our screens in our theaters. And that same thing equates into the home as well.
Eric, what's you're a DP? What's your perspective from the creative point of view?
Well, I think we're always chasing the audience goes to the theater for an escape. They want the experience of being wowed, and we have the obligation to give that to them. And as the audience gets more and more used to watching a 4K image at home, for example, we have to chase that a little bit so that when they go to the cinema for the cinema experience, I think we are obligated to give them the highest quality image we can, and 8K capture is one way to do that. I mean, as a more personal level for me, I think I would prefer the optics to be the bottleneck in terms of the image, and not the sensor resolution or the sharpness, so to speak, of the sensor. So the highest quality, the sharpest sensor, the highest resolution sensor possible is great for me, because that's where I start to see the optics fall apart. And for me, I feel like in that instance, I can make a more measured choice in terms of what I'm trying to give the audience visually. It has always led to a better image, in my opinion, when I've shot on a higher resolution sensor. So it's I look forward to the 12K capture workflow.
That's awesome.
I'll take a slightly different approach, because one of the arguments that people often feed me is they hold up a phone and they say, why would I need 8K if people are going to watch it on a phone or watch it on a TV? Or they try to get out their protractors and draw some sort of triangulation as to how far away you can see things. And the problem with that argument, because it makes absolutely no sense, I think you can prove it out by looking at the music industry. See, if the music industry was like the video industry, they would be capturing and recording songs in MP3s. Because if everybody's just going to listen to it with AirPods, which are not very good qualitatively, then why record anything better than that? But see, the music industry understands that if you start with more, you end with more. And you need to start at these ultra hi-fi sources to capture audio. And that way, when it gets filtered down to a 1 megabyte per minute file size, it actually still sounds good. And so when people make the 8K argument about resolution and clarity, what they're forgetting is that even if you are going to watch it on a phone or mobile device of some kind, the ability to start with more means that small, low quality result is going to look as good as it possibly can. Otherwise, we should record music in MP3 at the source, and we should shoot everything in HD at the source. And no one actually believes that, but they just don't chase the subject all the way through and figure out how it applies all the way down. So that's sort of my perspective on why we need 8K.
Yeah, no, I can completely agree with that. Like a good example would be, shows like Friends or Star Trek or X-Files, right? They all shot on 35 mil film when the standard time was standard def, right? So did they need to do it? No, because no one was visually, seeing the full 35 mil. But when you bring it down, it does look great. And now it's future proof. Those have all been remastered. I'm sure Friends is, watched everywhere across the world because it's been remastered to HD and so on. So they have that flexibility. Just because, you can't view or listen or see the source material currently at the way it is doesn't mean you're not going to be able to in the future.
Do you
That's
think
correct.
most people in the production environment understand the value of oversampling?
I actually don't think they all do, and we see that oftentimes at IMAX when filmmakers come in and are reviewing their movies and making the IMAX versions of Hollywood features, because they're seeing them for the first time on a much larger screen, and that image size starts to reveal those problems in the image, and they sometimes, that's where all of a sudden it's easy to make the point that, yeah, and you see it when we oftentimes in pre-production will do camera tests and lens tests with cinematographers on projects, and they're looking at, they may even want a lens that may be slightly diffused or vintage in terms of its look, and then they see it on a larger screen and they realize that it's actually not as sharp as they would like it to be, and they'll now make a more informed decision about how the quality of the image capture is really important on the front end. It's very easy to degrade something if you have something really stellar to begin with, if that's the creative choice that you want. But it's trying to make something look sharper and more detailed. If the resolution isn't there, you can't do it. So
sometimes post producers, but often executive producers view minimum delivery specs as dogma. They think of that as that's our capture spec, that's our workflow spec. So if one network or broadcaster is expecting nothing above 3.2K, then we don't need to shoot in anything beyond 3.2K, because they're not thinking about future proofing the project, or they're not thinking about oversampling, they're not thinking about scaling in the DI, they're not thinking about HDR finish or high-res delivery for theatrical release, etc. So it's very difficult sometimes to have that conversation.
Another benefit of the supersampling argument is the ability to maintain high quality when things actually go down the scale. So one of the reasons I've always been an advocate for high resolution capture is because, as Eric mentioned, you can break it down optically, but also when you take an image and you cut it in half, basically the theory essentially, every time you cut an image in half, it's the equivalent of minus 3 dB of gain, or essentially one stop of gain reduction. The reason this is significant is as you bring an image down by 50% or even more than that, there becomes a noise reduction. And that simply means you can actually push your images further at the source, because they're going to actually resolve by being super sampled. This is essentially why even when you watch HD, an IMAX image and a 35 image at HD don't look the same. We know that when you see an IMAX in 1080 and you see 35 in 1080, they don't look the same, because the IMAX super sample is so much more impressive and intense. If grain is what you're after, then that's easy to maintain or keep or add or adjust later. But the ability to understand that reducing actually makes images cleaner can contribute to their flexibility. And that's one of the advantages of supersampling.
We've been shooting broadcast television in 35 millimeter and then released it at 640 high. It's not a new idea, and not even close.
Yeah, and I like Michael. The word he said was flexibility, right? With the introduction of higher resolution, we've seen more creative options from directors and DPs. Like, just because you have the 8K canvas to work with doesn't mean you have to use all 8K. You can set frame guides inside. You have the ability to now pan and scan the image. You don't have to worry about when you stabilize losing any resolution and so on. So it just create up more creative controls for the creators out there.
So would you guys think that the education on the value of supersampling is one of the key things that this creative community and non-creative folks, decision makers, need to understand about 8K? Is that one of the key messages?
If we're going to exhibit in 4K, we should be or 8K. It's and because you don't achieve those oversampling results if it's a pixel for pixel delivery.
And just to make just for clarity, in IMAX, when we do our camera tests, and sometimes we're comparing between our IMAX film cameras, which are a 15 perf 65 millimeter negative, and which runs horizontally through the camera, still at 24 frames a second. So the film is really flying through the camera because the frames are so big. But everything we do is scanned at 8K. So whenever we're doing comparisons to other types of capture devices, the IMAX film cameras are scanned at 8K and played back then in 4K on our IMAX projection systems. And you really can see the difference. And that really is kind of that proof that Michael's saying, that it just that oversampling from the capture medium all the way through, even though it's being played back in 4K, it's really apparent. And even if you keep going down, like you said, it's even played back in HD, you'll see that increase in resolution on that IMAX film negative, since it was scanned, shot, because there's so much resolution on the negative because of its size to begin with, and then scanned at 8K, and even filtering all the way down through the process. That absolutely, it's very evident when you see that.
We were talking before this started about a practical example, and a year ago, a documentary about Apollo 11 came out, and if you haven't seen it, just get it. I think on Amazon Prime it's in 4K HDR. Just get it, because this is a perfect example. The very first shot that starts when you saw this, and I actually didn't know, I just clicked on it. I didn't know what I was getting into when I watched this documentary, but the very first shot comes up and I almost fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It looked like a visual effect because it was clearly vintage, but the quality was modern. It had the everyone was dressed, in vintage clothes, and yet the quality was up to date. This is a perfect example when people are asking, I think Eric used the word dogmatic approach to the specs of deliverables. When you look at it that way, you're essentially trapping yourself in time. You're essentially making yourself into a time machine or time capsule, and you're trapping yourself in time because your image will never be better than that. And the Apollo 11 documentary, even if you watch it in HD, is going to produce images that I would say some people have never seen before because it was shot on 1570. And that's the type of effect that I think, Eric, to quote you again, you said we're obligated. The creative industry is obligated to provide the best quality that we can. I honestly think that is part of the transaction that we have to engage in when we make content and have customers watch it, have consumers watch it. That is a transaction, and our part of that process is to provide the best quality we possibly can. And I think hitting the lowest common denominator, or the average common denominator, which is how some people look at this assignment, is a totally flawed logic.
Yeah. People still wince when they hear 8K, right? And that happened when 4K came out, right? People were like, oh, why? And now it's completely accepted, right? Once people start understanding how to use it and best take advantage of it, it changes, their minds. And that's one thing. Once it's out there and once you're using it, it's a game changer.
I was just going to say that, at least in the immediacy, the capture in 8K and then the delivery into 4K is a totally acceptable, common workflow that we're using every day, and it doesn't really affect post at all in the immediacy, while still allowing that future proofing for that content to exist for years to come.
You mentioned the parallels with 4K, maybe 6 or so years ago. I think all of you on the call have been through that transition. So how similar do you think we are with the 8K transition at this point versus the 4K transition 6 or so years ago?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. I do feel like technology has increased a lot faster than the 4K transition, right? Because I remember when 4K came out, it took a long time for hardware to get to a certain price point and to buy consumer TVs and so on. Like in 2015, we released our 8K camera, and it was very hard to play back 8K, right? Or to view 8K. I think Michael had some massive beast TV he showed off one time where he had to send 4K signals to it to play it back. But it wasn't easy, right? It wasn't easy to play back 8K 5 years ago in 2015. Now, like, you can go purchase a graphics card, even a laptop. I can play back 8K real time off a laptop, which is kind of crazy. But the hardware with NVIDIA and what they're doing with graphics cards, the processing power with CPUs and AMD and what they're doing, and even the price point. Like I can go online and buy 8K TV for what, $2,000. Like it's catching up and going much faster than what 4K did, and it's pretty easy now.
For the technologist watching, that's kind of a fun thing. Dan, it was actually not, it was 16 HD signals in 2015.
Even worse.
That's what we had to build. And that was the only way to make it work. HD signals. And, but what you're pointing out that's really significant for the technological trends that we can anticipate, we can look at the past being prologue, is that when 4K came online, we also had to overcome people that were addicted to videotape, right? We didn't have, SAN infrastructures were not typical yet. They were sort of an outlier still. And you had people that were not experienced with, hard drives and media as a file as much. They wanted these assets, and they didn't understand the recycling process of cards and things like that. That was still new concepts, not to mention the hardware limitations. So we can expect 8K to take off much quicker because it is absolutely pretty simple and very inexpensive. We didn't have GPUs in 2007 when the Red One came out. There wasn't GPU technology, hadn't been invented yet for the acceleration that we use today. The video game market hadn't exploded in the way it does now. So these are all things that delayed the onboarding of 4K, which we don't have to have those hurdles be as tall for 8K. I think what we're doing and what we need to do, and the 8K Association can help with this, is we just need to make sure that people understand that upgrading their mind has to happen in concert with upgrading their hardware technology. If we can't keep those in sync, there's always going to be stragglers. There's always going to be naysayers and people that argue with that. So those are the two things we need to kind of keep together.
I think specifically from the capture standpoint, capturing in 8K doesn't mean you have to work in 8K throughout the post process in the immediacy, and there's always the opportunity to go back and at least in the red, can retranscode that into a higher resolution master file, whether it's OpenEXR or DPX or whatever. So you can take that 8K camera negative, transcode it for conform purposes or editorial purposes into lower resolution, and then go back and finish that. Okay, you can't do that from a 3.2K or 4K capture, without the dupe ratio problems that presents.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is point out is in Hollywood, most of the biggest movies, which are not only the most expensive movies, but have a lot of visual effects in them, they typically are finishing all their visual effects at 4K, at 2K actually. So even though they may be capturing in 8K or 6K with their camera, they're actually doing post-production in most cases in 2K. And part of that is because of time needed to finish VFX in 4K or higher and money. So it's kind of ironic that the big giant movies typically aren't able to do that. I think in the future that'll change as render speeds continue to increase and costs may become more similar. But it's some of the simpler movies or some television product that can actually be finished at least natively in 4K all the way through, and you can see a difference there too. So that's also something there. I think the industry needs to really push, even from a Hollywood standpoint, to trying to finish at higher resolutions for visual effects in particular, and especially for what we call like hero shots, plate shots, things where the increase in resolution is more apparent.
So where in the capture process does it make sense to capture an 8K?
So there would be a time and place, but ideally, as long as it doesn't interfere with your creative process, and it's just as easy to shoot 8K as it is 4K. It's not that much harder whatsoever. And the hard drive space, that's always a big complaint we always hear. Well, it must be very large files that are massive. Like codecs are so efficient these days. Yes, hard drives have gotten much cheaper, which is great, but in terms of file size of codecs, they're all very, very small. So no one believes me when I ever talk about our red code and red files and how we capture how small they are. But across the board, codecs just in general have got so efficient that it's not hard to capture high resolution data onto your media and storage.
People are always going to be skeptical about any change to their pipeline. So what we have to do is make sure we encourage people to have resources, explore what resources are available to ensure that they know what's out there. Dan's point is really strong. And then I would also say that when it comes to future proofing, people that want their content to last a long time simply just need to make the decision. The fact that Bruce's comment about visual effects taking more time and costing more in the big sector, it really comes down to a decision that needs to be made. Because in my experience, I have not seen visual effects actually be inhibited by 4K requirements with 8K source files. You just have to make that decision and pivot your pipeline to make sure that you do that. A 8K file in an HD pipeline will not work. That's absolutely true. But an 8K file in an 8K pipeline works just as smooth as HD. And that's what you just have to prepare your technology to make sure that you're able to handle that new bucket.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. It's a lot of advanced planning that needs to take place from a pre-production, production, and post-production. You got to make sure all the different, the groups are kind of together in creating that pipeline and workflow that's going to optimize for higher resolution finishing, whatever that resolution choice may be. But that's where I think, some studios and some filmmakers do a much better job at that than others. But I think that's, and part of, sometimes it's a money thing. Money can come into play into that decision. But that's where I think hopefully the studios also realize that there is a value to spending some more money initially to get that higher resolution, kind of mezzanine master, if you will, to have in your back pocket for now and the future.
So Eric, I remember you told me that when you were doing the production of Mindhunters, there was a conversation that went on about do we capture in 4K, 6K? Tell us how that conversation went.
Well, we had done the first season sensor on the red, which was a 6K sensor, and we were moving in to do the second season, and we're interested in exploring the helium sensor and capturing an 8K, and there was some discussion around how we would manage the file size, and ultimately we did a series of tests, and we looked at and raising the compression rate, going from 4:1 compression in 6K to 8:1 compression in 8K, and then we did comparative tests and looked at it at various resolutions, and we found not only a significant increase in quality, both in color fidelity and noise reduction, but no change in file size as a result of the compression shift, and so it was a no-brainer, and it resulted in no additional cost for production at all. Actually, no additional camera cards, no hardware changes on the post-production side, and in terms of the archival, it was identical space requirements. So it to pay dividends in the end, with really no change in our process at all.
That's actually very encouraging. I'm surprised maybe there was some pushback before you had that data, I would assume, right?
Well, there was some initial speculation as to what it might go, and I think that there's always anytime anyone pushes unexplored technology, particularly in post-production, post-producers are typically very conservative, as they should be, because they have tremendous responsibility. But we're fortunate to have people that are very forward-thinking and willing to explore things, and so that's what we did, and it worked out really well. But yeah, I think always a little bit of uneasiness, and that's the necessity for testing. That is what we have to do is test and explore and see where the improvements are, and where there aren't improvements, then direction. But in this case, it proved to be unbelievably beneficial for lots of reasons.
So Dan, you mentioned from a workflow perspective that it's actually quite easy to work with 4K content. You can do it on your laptop now. GPUs are getting great. But Michael, I wanted to ask you specifically about taking the workflow to the cloud. And that's what part of what Frame.io is all about, is cloud infrastructure. Tell us how this is going to work with 8K, for example.
Well, that's actually a great question. And the answer is relatively simple because what we're going to be relying on in the cloud is more cloud processing. So the files will go into the cloud, they will live in the cloud permanently, and we won't even pull them down anymore to work with them. All the processing will happen remotely. All the actual editing will happen completely remotely. Whether you use proxies or you use the original camera files, this will all happen virtualized. And so people won't need in the future hard drives on their desks or SANs to connect to. They won't need high-powered computers in their space anymore. People will just remote in and do everything remotely. So the quality and the resolution and the data rates and all those aspects that govern so many decisions in working with high quality files will kind of be erased. And so the argument that as camera files get bigger and better, it's going to hurt or impact the post-production world. Actually, we're about to have a tipping point where it all sort of just melts away because you'll never have the files locally to you anywhere. So a virtualized future, which Frame.io is a believer in a cloud-based platform and making a cloud-based operating system. That's where companies like ours and other groups that support the same principles will succeed in the future.
And you actually demonstrated this at HPA back in, was it February, I guess, with the Lost Laser Hosen production. Tell us how that workflow worked a little bit, if you can.
Yeah, essentially, we are capturing files right from the camera, stringing them to the cloud. Those files in the cloud are proxy files, and then you can edit in any number of programs that allow you to edit off cloud proxies. And then you upload the original 8K files into the cloud, and those are swapped out. So the instant daily is a proxy file, and then that's replaced with the original raw file later. And all that can be maintained in a cloud mezzanine. So whether or not you're working with a proxy or a raw file somewhat becomes arbitrary. We're in the early stages of this being deployed industry-wide, but make no mistake, the reason people should not fear cloud-based technologies or 8K, 12K, 16K technologies is because the load and the weight of these assets in every shape and form will not be localized. Today, we make based on localized feelings, a localized result, what it's like to have the asset with you. When that's completely virtualized, you won't worry about it. You won't really care that much. You'll only care about the results that you're able to get. And that's why the high resolution, high bit depth companies will ultimately win, because the results will be better when you're working with the files.
So I thought I would finish off with a kind of a general question for each of you. Specifically, what are the kind of major challenges that you see for adoption of 8K in the ecosystem today? Whether those are technical or financial or psychological, for that matter.
When they're communicated clearly, and in terms that those who are in the position to make those decisions can understand. The difficulty in most cases, at least in the short term, is explaining the values, at least on the capture end, of how it can the quality of the delivery in the immediacy, and then how it can proceed to deliver in the future, and that that is a challenge because there's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction in many cases, and it takes a moment to sort of educate everybody in terms of where the benefits are. But then once you get past that, I think you see very, very fast adoption, and in my experience, immediate recognition of high resolution capture. So it's simply a matter of navigating the costs involved and the information.
Once they capture 8K content and get to see the file size or get to see playback on their hardware and see that's not as hard as what they thought it would be, it will change their mind. It's just that misconceptions out there that might have been true at one point but aren't true anymore.
they will err on the side of caution, and the caution is to just stay where you are. And I think as people are willing to be pushed, we have companies like Netflix that actually pushes people, Imax that pushes people, Apple that pushes people to engage in new technologies. That's forced people to realize that the myths that they fear about high quality kind of melt away. And we just got to keep doing that so that as 8K televisions become real for everybody, that we aren't behind the eight ball as professionals.
Yeah, it is. And I agree. It's with you guys. It's really an investment in kind of the future, but it's not really the future because the future is today. Years ago when studios were remastering older content, and some of them chose to do scan and remasters in 4K. This was before 4K even really were out in TVs, but the ability to do that was there, and they made that choice, which turned out to be a wise choice. And some people didn't do that, and then they had to remaster again, and now they're looking at remastering yet again. So it's really about, 8K is here. You really want to try and create that mezzanine master file that is the highest quality all the way through. And it is kind of there. And while there may be issues with costs and possibly things taking a little longer in some regards, it's really, the more we start to do it, the more we'll realize the efficiencies in the workflow as both content creators and post-production facilities and visual effects houses all kind of work together to kind of move everything up that ladder to the highest thing. And I think we can really benefit from those shared costs, and I shouldn't say shared costs, but resource efficiencies by moving to a more of an 8K higher resolution platform all the way through the process. I think it benefits everybody, including the consumers, and that's who ultimately we're making content for.
Well, you've certainly laid out some of the things that we need to do from the 8K Association point of view. We need to do some education of professionals and consumers, don't we? And we will talk again soon. This is Chris Chinnock for the 8K Association. Thank you for listening.